The success of the original Nintendo Entertainment System came with some classic and lifelong properties we are still enjoying today. Games like Zelda, Mario, Kirby, and more are still being published and enjoyed by millions. However, Nintendo wasn't the only one who gave us some amazing new games and titles. One of the most successful third-party companies of the 8-bit era who made its footprint during the reign of the NES was Konami. Konami, who partnered exclusively with Nintendo for console games in the mid to late 80s, gave us games like Contra, Castlevania, and Top Gun. But how did one of the first and most popular horror franchises of the 8-bit era transition into the 16-bit era and find itself in the middle of the console wars? How did each game differ on each system? Today, on this episode of Bit Wars, we will talk about one of Konami's most successful franchises, Castlevania. In particular, Super Castlevania on the SNES and Castlevania Bloodlines on the Sega Genesis. In 1989, creator and lead programmer Masashiro Ueno was tasked with the development of Konami's first Castlevania on Nintendo's new 16-bit console, the Super Nintendo. This game, called Super Castlevania IV, was Ueno's first 16-bit game, and he had some heavy expectations to fill. Ueno, a big fan of the original Castlevania, wanted to stay true to the original game and decided to keep it as a linear side-scrolling action game without the branching paths that were part of the third installment of the series, Castlevania III, which was also being developed for the NES at the same time as Ueno's 16-bit entry. Ueno, while tasked with working on the SNES Castlevania, was not part of the development team heading up Castlevania Dracula's Curse. Because of this, all he had to reference were the first two entries into the series, Castlevania I and Castlevania II, Simon's Quest. Super Castlevania IV would see the return of Simon Belmont from Castlevania I and Simon's Quest. While Ueno considered the game a remake of the first game, Konami later changed the story to take place after the first two games. This is noted in the American Manual Prologue. It is time once again for Simon Belmont to call forth the powers of good to aid him in his battle. With new hardware came new challenges for the development team. At the time of early development, dev units for the SNES were not available, and early development was done on the original Nintendo Entertainment System. Later on in development, programmers were able to take advantage of the new hardware and really show off what Nintendo's new 16-bit powerhouse could do. The first big change we saw from previous entries was a major step up graphically. Bigger sprites meant we could now see more detail in Simon. Enemies seemed to be more menacing, and we even saw scalable bosses such as the Golem boss. A boss whose pieces chipped away and appeared almost 3D. Ueno made sure to take advantage of the new Mode 7 technology, which allowed for more of these 3D-like effects. This gave us an entirely rotating level that left those with uneasy stomachs dizzy and lightheaded, and also an entire level that turned completely on its side. Gameplay was a massive step up from the previous entries. Ideas that Konami had in the NES-era Castlevania games that were held back by limited hardware could now be a reality. Simon could only previously whip forward in the NES Castlevania games. was now capable of whipping not just forward, but diagonally, upwards, and downwards. Another new whip feature enabled the player to spin the whip. This new mechanic came in handy when taking out those annoying bats and Medusa heads. Another new game mechanic feature was the ability to swing from objects with the whip, which added a new level to the platforming. The music for Super Castlevania IV was composed by Masanori Adaki and Taro Kudo. Uono wanted to make the environment of Super Castlevania IV more interactive, and was proud of how the game's sound effects and music contributed to the atmosphere. The Super Nintendo, now using 2 chips to produce sound, gave the composers larger creative boundaries that were previously unexplored. We got new revised versions of The Beginning, Vampire Killer, and Bloody Tears. Now with real flutes and more bass, creating a more foreboding atmosphere. Not only did we get to hear our favorite themes remade on the SNES hardware sound chips, but we also got new entries into the series like Simon's theme that would show up in future titles of the series. As great and iconic as Super Castlevania IV was, it was certainly not without its faults. With new hardware came new struggles, and this was evident in many periods of slowdown the game experienced in boss fights, and when the screen became loaded with moving objects and enemies. While the game may have had its slowdowns, it certainly does not break the game. All this said, Konami and Uono gave us one of the most iconic Castlevania experiences, with GameSpot giving it the #1 spot among all Castlevania games, and many others having it in their top 3 of the series. In the 80s, Konami had been catering to Nintendo exclusively. In 1991, Konami began working with Nintendo's competitors, and in 1992 they became an official third-party developer for the Sega Genesis. In 1993, Konami began programming for a Sega-exclusive Castlevania game, which would become Castlevania Bloodlines, or Castlevania New Generations in Europe and Vampire Killer in Japan. In March 1994, late in the lifespan of the Genesis, Sega fans finally got their own Castlevania game. Castlevania Bloodlines was the first game in the series to not feature a Belmont as the main protagonist. This time around, the development team wanted to create a whole new experience with new characters, all while keeping the main theme of the classic games intact. Toshika Yamamuro, the lead programmer, wanted to challenge the team by not using the traditional Akumaja Dracula title. He was also quoted as saying that many of the previous environments, as seen in Super Castlevania IV and Rondo of Blood, just couldn't be done with the Genesis hardware. Yamamura, who is a big fan of previous Castlevania titles, made sure to work Bloodlines into the main canon. The game takes place as the second act, stated Yamamura, and takes place years after Richter Belmont in Rondo of Blood. In Castlevania Bloodlines, we have the choice of playing as 2 different characters: John Morris, the son of Quincy Morris, who now yields the famous Vampire Killer and is a descendant in the Belmont family clan, or Eric Liccardi, friend of John Morris and the wielder of the Alucard Spear, who sets out to avenge his fiancée, who is trapped and killed by Dracula. Yamamura, a big fan of Bram Stoker's Dracula, took much inspirations from the novel. This was evident in much of the artwork, historic European scenery, and even John Morris himself. In previous Castlevania games, players were limited to Dracula's castle, or Transylvania. This time, players are led through Europe chasing down Elizabeth Bartley, who is set on resurrecting Dracula and who was killed by John Morris's father, Quincy Morris. The game, now having two different protagonists, offers two very different types of experiences from the previous installments. The Alucard's spear, when mastered and fully upgraded, allows for a much easier experience than John Morris's traditional vampire killer whip. It also allows for slightly more replayability now that both characters offer different endings to the game. While Tasaki Seiki was limited with the Genesis color palette, Bloodlines didn't offer the same larger sprite work that's in the Super Nintendo counterpart. However, Tasaku made sure to take advantage of the Genesis hardware when he could. The game played much faster than Super Castlevania IV, and in some moments felt even closer to a Contra-style run-and-gun versus the classic Castlevania we were used to. While the Genesis carts at the time were only 8 megabytes, the game still gave us some very impressive level designs, like Atlantis, with moving and reflective water used in previous titles by Konami. And the Leaning Tower of Pisa in Italy, which seemed to sway and move and spin as the character traversed outside of the building. Not only were there many impressive levels, but there were also new types of bosses not seen in previous iterations. Michiru Yamamane, who was tasked with the soundtrack and knew how successful and popular previous soundtracks were. She knew that nothing short of a masterpiece would be acceptable. We saw the return of Simon's theme, a nod to the Super Castlevania IV title. And much like Castlevania IV, we saw the return of many popular tracks and new ones to add. Yamamane, who was able to take full advantage of the 6-channel chip in the Sega Genesis, delivered a unique and classic Castlevania soundtrack that we will never forget. While Castlevania Bloodlines may have been the last 16-bit Castlevania game, it was also one of the most unique. From new players to new level designs, a new story added with the classic Genesis sound, it is one of the most beloved and sometimes underrated games of the franchise. Today, the Bit Wars still rage. In our most recent channel poll, we asked, which was your favorite Castlevania game of the 16-bit era? The results were Super Castlevania receiving 45% of the votes, Rondo of Blood receiving 40% of the votes, and Bloodlines only got a measly 15%. It's okay, Sega fans. We know the real truth. The 16-bit era gave us plenty of Castlevania titles we can still enjoy to this day. Some we didn't even talk about on this video, but that's for another day. But all of us retro gamers can surely agree that the 16-bit Castlevania games, across all systems, are some of the best the franchise has ever had to offer. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Bit Wars. Be sure to vote in our next poll for our next episode, and if you liked what you saw, subscribe and stick around for a while. Until next time, enough talk! Have at you!
Oh my! He's on fire!